Okay, so evaluating a president is not easy. It's not just about headlines or Twitter threads or viral videos. It's about policy follow through, economic outcomes, governance, and trust. And if we're asking ourselves whether Cyril Ramaphosa ranks as the worst president that South Africa has had since 1994, we have to go through the facts carefully. Because in politics, narrative often overtakes nuance, but the numbers don't lie unless they have been cooked very well. Okay, let's start with policy follow through. Ramaphosa entered office in 2008 on a wave of optimism. Not for me, I was always skeptical about him from the start, but the media and the business community called it a new dawn. He promised anti corruption reform, economic recovery, land redistribution, job creation, fiscal discipline. Fast forward to 2025, and most of these promises remain unfulfilled or stalled at best. The National Development Plan still reads like a wish list rather than an implementation roadmap. Structural reforms in critical sectors like energy, mining, logistics, and manufacturing have been sluggish, to put it mildly. ESCOM, the state's Achilles heel, remains a monumental failure. Rolling blackouts have become a defining feature of his presidency, bleeding productivity from every level of the economy. These are not minor inconveniences. They are a systemic tax on business operations, investor confidence, and household stability. You cannot claim policy leadership while governing reactively, constantly responding to crises that should have been prevented years ago. Unemployment paints an even bleaker picture. As of 2025, official unemployment sits stubbornly around 32%, with youth unemployment oscillating between 60 and 65%. These are catastrophic numbers by any standard, not just statistics. They represent millions of young South Africans without a foothold in the economy. Ramaphosa inherited structural unemployment, sure, but his administration's interventions have been cosmetic. Incentives for small businesses, supposed red tape reduction schemes, and the much touted presidential employment stimulus have made little measurable impact. South Africa's job creation strategy is mostly a bureaucratic carousel with announcements, summits, and committees, while the real economy, the one that employs ordinary people, continues to shrink under regulation and uncertainty. The gap between economic rhetoric and lived reality has never been wider. GDP growth has not offered relief either. Since 2018, South Africa's economy has limped along at an average of 1.2% growth per year. The pandemic years made that worse, but even in recovery, the momentum has been anemic. The IMF and World Bank have both flagged that this trajectory is insufficient to reduce poverty or absorb new entrants into the labor market. The structural drivers of the economy, such as electricity supply, logistics, policy clarity, remain stuck in perpetual reform phase. The annual investment summits, once heralded as a turning point, have become symbolic exercises. Billions in pledge investments have yet to materialize into tangible economic activity. For citizens, that translates to stagnant wages, rising living costs, and deepening inequality. Inflation shocks hit hardest at the bottom, and the government's response: more grants, more debt, more rhetoric, only papers over the cracks. And then there is the question of corruption and governance. The Zondo Commission exposed in painful detail the rot of state capture, and Ramaphosa promised a decisive cleanup. 7 years later, the record is mixed at best. Yeah, a handful of prosecutions are underway and a few big names have been charged, but systemic accountability remains elusive. Billions continue to vanish through procurement fraud and mismanagement, particularly within state owned enterprises. The pattern has not changed, it's just become more sophisticated. The ANC's internal power struggles, the coalition negotiations, and patronage politics have diluted every accountability mechanism. Public perception has shifted from hope to fatigue. South Africans no longer expect reform. They expect more scandal, more excuses, and more commissions that lead to nowhere. Now, with the formation of the GNU, the Government of National Unity, in 2024, there was a brief sense that perhaps shared governance could force renewal. Instead, what we're seeing is a coalition built on political compromise rather than principle. The GNU has created more bureaucracy, not more efficiency. Every decision now requires balancing fragile alliances instead of serving the citizen. It's coalition politics masquerading as reform. Policy paralysis is baked into the system now. And while the political class negotiates for influence, service delivery collapses, infrastructure delays, and unemployment festers. The GNU has not brought stability. It's institutionalized indecision. Then we have the issue of perception, leadership optics. Ramaphosa's frequent diplomatic travel have raised some eyebrows. On paper, these trips are framed as investment drives or diplomatic outreach. In practice, the timing often coincides with domestic crises, load shedding peaks, public sector strikes, or economic downgrades. When your country is in crisis, being seen abroad too often becomes a liability. It feeds the narrative of detachment, of leadership that lives above the consequences of its own policies.
Why do so many people live in abject poverty and so few live lives of opulence?
The question of personal wealth also lingers. Ramaphosa's business interests, particularly his significant private holdings, have remained a point of public contention. His income outside the presidency is perfectly legal, but ethically questionable in the context of widespread poverty. South Africa's president is among the wealthiest individuals in government, presiding over a nation where over 80 million citizens rely on social grants to survive. That disconnect breeds cynicism. It's not just about legality, it's about legitimacy. A wealthy president promising equality during record unemployment feels performative and not empathetic. And when a leader's personal assets grow while the national economy stagnates, the moral authority to preach austerity or fiscal discipline just completely evaporates. Public dissatisfaction is not just high, it's hardened. Polls across the last 5 years consistently show a steady erosion of faith in government, particularly around corruption, economic stagnation, and service delivery. Citizens no longer just complain about potholes or rolling blackouts anymore. They see them as symptoms of a system that has lost all sense of accountability. Hospitals are under-equipped, municipal budgets are drained by mismanagement, and even the most basic infrastructure projects collapse under red tape and kickbacks. Social media amplifies this decay daily because there are videos of sewage spills, collapsed bridges, and load shedding schedules which circulate faster than any official response. What used to be frustration has now turned into fatigue. South Africans don't just doubt that things will improve, they doubt that anyone in power is still trying. Corruption remains the core infection. Sure, Ramaphosa's name is not directly tied to some of the scandals of the Zuma era, even though he has some of his own, but his administration's most daunting problem is paralysis. Eskom, Transnet, Prasa, all still hemorrhaging billions through mismanagement and fraudulent tenders. I mean, we have seen investigations pile up, committees form, and then reports just gather dust. For all the talk of clean governance, too many of the same players remain embedded in the system, and too few have ever seen a courtroom, let alone a conviction. Under his watch, corruption remains consequence free. South Africans have learned that in this government, accountability is just another word for commission. It's important to acknowledge the inherited wreckage, the structural rot. There's inequality, education is collapsing, unemployment. It didn't begin in 2018. We understand this. Decades of policy inconsistency, cadre deployment, and public sector bloat hollowed out the state long before Ramaphosa arrived. He did inherit a bit of a mess, an economy maybe limping post-COVID, a national grid on life support, and a population losing faith in democracy itself. But leadership is not about sympathy for circumstance. Leadership is about outcomes. And the outcomes here speak for themselves. There's a stagnant GDP, record youth unemployment, persistent inequality, and collapsing institutions. Whatever optimism Ramaphosa sparked in 2018 has long since been replaced by grim realism. The comparisons here tell the story. Under Mbeki, the economy grew, inflation stabilized, and South Africa gained a global reputation for fiscal prudence, even if it seems to have failed with the whole HIV/AIDS thing. Mandela's term was about moral leadership and reconciliation. Zuma's presidency, though now synonymous with looting, at least began with populist economic expansion before devolving into state capture. But Ramaphosa, by contrast, has governed in slow motion. He has been too cautious to offend the party, too corporate to inspire the people. He has stabilized the decline, but he hasn't reversed it. South Africa today feels like it's idling in neutral, burning fuel, but going absolutely nowhere. Numbers confirm this stagnation. GDP growth barely touches 1%. Unemployment hovers near 33%, with youth unemployment over 50%. Load shedding has shaved entire percentage points of productivity. Tax revenue lags behind expenditure, while debt to GDP creeps toward unsustainable levels. Yet these are only the metrics. The lived experience is worse. Ordinary people are losing patience because they no longer see the link between hard work, taxation, and reward. Government failures are personal now. When the lights go out during dinner, when the hospital has no medicine, when police ignore a robbery, that is where governance dies, not in policy papers, but in daily life. And this is the tragedy of Ramaphosa's presidency. He might not have destroyed the house, but he hasn't repaired it either. The rhetoric of reform is relentless. Social compacts, investment summits, renewal, capacity building. But the results are scarce. He talks a good game about building a capable state, while the capable ones are the ones leaving it. He promises jobs, but all he delivers are committees. Even when he does act, it often feels too late or too soft or too fragmented to matter. The result is a government that looks busy but achieves very, very little, an excellent masterclass in optics over output. To call him the worst president might be a little unfair. He hasn't driven the country off a cliff yet, hopefully never, but he hasn't changed the direction either. He's managed decline instead of reversing it with grit. His presidency feels less like a turning point and more like a holding pattern, keeping South Africa from total collapse, but unable to lift it off the ground. And in the end, governance is not judged by calm speeches or steady hands or a laugh. It's judged by outcomes. South Africans don't need more commissions or speeches or summits. They need delivery. They need energy, water, jobs, safety, all of the basics. Until those arrives, the verdict is clear. The promise of renewal was never fulfilled. The gap between what citizens were told and what they actually experienced is now the chasm defining his presidency. So you tell me, is Cyril Ramaphosa the worst president South Africa has been plagued with? Tell me. I will be reading the comments to hear your thoughts.
Don't run! Don't run!